we've come to the end of our presentation now. We just wanted to summarise the consultation and how you can get involved in that going forward. So as already mentioned, we had our drop-in session at the weekend where we had a large number of people that came down. We're obviously doing this online webinar tonight, which will be on the website. We also held a specific tenant drop-in session today as well. We have community workshops taking place later on this month. If you haven't already registered for a place on that, then please do. We'll be sending some more information out about that shortly. We've also got our Prestwich Village Consultation Liaison Group, which is made up of stakeholder representatives and elected representatives in the area. You can submit your responses to us either via the free post envelope that you'll have had if you got your newsletter through your door, or you can do it online. And if you've got any questions, you can get in touch with us through the various contact channels, so please do. We're now going to move to our Q&A session. If I could please invite back Stuart, Lindsay, Councillor O'Brien and Paul. Thank you, everybody. So we've had lots of questions coming through. Thanks to everyone that's put their questions in. I'm going to try and theme these together as best as we can. So first one is around the quantum of space for housing versus the space for retail and the space for the community hub. So John, I wonder if you could kind of come in on that one and just give us a bit of a view on how you got to that mix, and just give us a bit of an indication of how much space is being allocated to these retail areas and to the community hub.
Space-wise, in terms of areas, it's still very, very early doors, still very early in the process. The market research that's been undertaken by the team will directly inform the quantum of retail as we move into the next stage. Percentage-wise, at the moment, we haven't really got a distinction between them. It's more about applying the right space in the right place at this time. We haven't yet worked out the number of dwellings. That's going to be informed again through the process as we move it forwards.
And in terms of the heights of the buildings, do we know what they will be yet?
Again, heights of the buildings will be directly informed by the analysis that we're undertaking at the moment. What I would like to say is we won't be going any taller than the radius. We probably may not even be as tall as the radius. Any height that goes into the master plan will be directly informed by very detailed analysis of sun path. So looking at how we've talked about today how positive the streets are and giving the streets back to the pedestrians, giving the streets back to people. What we want to ensure that any streets that we do give back maximise daylight. We don't want to create overshadowing. So that will be very carefully worked out as we start to look at the massing of the buildings. And again, sorry, just to finish on that, it's looking at the existing context, looking at the roofscape that exists in and around the site at the moment and responding to that. Going back to what I said before about the character of the buildings, we want to make sure that these buildings, when they come forward, they feel not just characterful in their look, their tone, their texture, but scale as well, scale and massing. Scaling massing is really pivotal to the way you bring forward a master plan. And we want to make sure that the scale and massing of this master plan works with the scale and massing of the existing context in and around the master plan.
So I guess the key message there, John, is that these things haven't been determined yet. We're consulting at an early stage. If you've got some views, let us know.
Please do.
Thank you very much.
The key bit, Rebecca, if it's okay, if I can just add to that. So our knowledge and experience and history of mixed use regeneration is exactly that. It has to be mixed use. Exactly what that mix is hasn't been determined yet, but I don't mind being open with some of the conversations. We've been speaking with the council, and it's a very delicate balance of, there's a real thriving high street in Prestwich, and we don't want the new Prestwich Village proposals within our red line to draw everyone off the high. It has to really complement. So as John said, it's not been absolutely determined, but what we are really keen to do is make sure it ties in with everything else outside of the red line. We're not focusing in the red line and doing everything we can and putting all the retail in as many houses. It's just not about that for us. It's creating a place that complements Prestwich and actually has all of that community engagement. Can we have a gym? Can we have a market? All these questions are great for us because we can start go away and working on what those spaces might look like.
Thanks, Councillor O'Brien. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, just very quickly, Rebecca. So building on Stuart's point about this tying in with the rest of of the sort of village and the wider town. I think one of the criticisms I've picked up over many years is the radius block, the apartments next to the site don't do that. They sort of contrast quite abruptly with the space around it. And so, yes, there's always going to be questions about height and scale. But I think what we're quite clear on, and what we probably could say at this point, is the intention is not to sort of copy and paste that and just do that, 6, 7, 8 times over and cram as much in. So I think it is important that residents do get some reassurance actually at this stage, that whilst there's obviously going to be some debate about exact heights, and it might vary actually depending on the plot, the place within the plot, and the purpose of what would be in that building, that we're not looking at that as a model to work from. We're actually looking much wider to the high street, into the town, to look what could actually be reflected back in the village.
And we want a centre and a square that people are going to use. So kind of the daylight and sunlight, swept path analysis are all going to happen. And we've already challenged John on heights of buildings on the south side to make sure you're getting sun through the day and in the evenings into the square. All these things are in our mind, but just not set. I think that's the key bit. Nothing's set yet, but we've been through these processes quite a few times over the years. So they're all there to be tested over the next 6, 7 months while we develop up the detailed plans.
I think, Stuart, it'd be useful to kind of expand on that a little bit, because we have had a couple of questions around how you ensure that, that there won't be dark corridors, dark windy corridors. So maybe just explain a little bit about that kind of process and how we ensure that there is access to that light.
Yeah, I mean, happy for John and Lindsay to jump in as well. It's a design process based on surveys, studies, building design. If there's wind issues that come out of the wind assessments, we deal with them through mitigation. Hopefully, Lindsay will get that through trees rather than big metal baffle. It will be carefully. We've picked up there's wind tunneling issues, I think, in some of the locations from previous liaison groups and out of Sunday. There's flood issues that we'll deal with through sustainable drainage. So there's really nice positive responses to deal with all these kind of hard technical issues. But I don't know, John, Lindsay, from a design perspective.
In terms of, I suppose from our side, in terms of the massing of the buildings, just to reiterate what I said earlier, which is when we are looking at the massing with the team and the placement and location of buildings, we're constantly checking it against sun path. We're sweeping it with the sun all the time to ensure, and again working with Lindsay, to ensure that the spaces we are creating at ground floor are maximising or optimising the access to daylight. We don't want to create dark, shady spaces. We don't want to create windy spaces. Again, there'll be wind tunnel testing and all of that sort of stuff that will be undertaken to assess and determine and design out issues such as wind and solar and shading. So it's a constant thing through the design process that we're checking in with to ensure that the final product delivers the best product, the best solution.
I think, what you're saying, John, around some of the buildings, when you describe some of the beginning of the thinking around the architecture, that actually these aren't frictionless buildings. These are buildings with lots of things going on at the lower levels, with the upper levels. They're not long blocks, they're short blocks. We've hopefully demonstrated through the work we've done that we're trying to tie back into the grain of the place. So these are shorter lengths with a hierarchy of scale of streets and spaces that actually don't create this corridor effect. So we're introducing trees. So it's a place first approach to the design. It's about, well, okay, we want a street that's wide enough to have a tree. So we want people to be at the ground floor. So how do we design a street around that? And then how does the architecture fit around it? Rather than this is what you've got as a corridor. It's a sort of an Arndale-esque corridor space that's 6 meters wide and frictionless all the way along, and that's not going to work. That's not creating a grain of a place and creating a rhythm to a village. That's the absolute opposite to what we're trying to create here. The successful places happen at the ground floor, and that's what feeds the community as a place. I mean, we've started from the point that the value of the we're landscape architects, urbanists. We've started from the point that the value of the spaces between the buildings is more valuable than the buildings, and that to us is that's the real estate, and that's where you generate the value in a place.
Thanks very much. Paul, perhaps I could bring you in now. I've got a couple of questions for you, but I don't know if you want to introduce yourself first.
Yeah, I'm Paul Lakin. I'm Executive Director of Place at Bury Council and responsible for the, among other things, the regeneration programmes in the borough.
Thanks, Paul. We've had a few people asking about what will happen to the current health centre. Will that be incorporated into the scheme? And also questions around what will happen to the library.
Yeah, in terms of the health provision, we certainly want the existing practices to move into the new hub building. We think having one public sector hub building would make sense, but they're independent businesses. So we will work with them to try and make sure they occupy that part of the scheme. In terms of the library, we will, the objective is to re-provide the library within the hub building. I think, we need to look at what supplemental kind of features the library might have in terms of flexible spaces that can be used for hire for groups or for community groups or for community cinema. So part of the design of that will be to build some inherent flexibility into the space so we can use it really effectively. I think, it's very much up for grabs in terms of a part of the consultation about the nature of the kind of mix of things we put in there. I mean, there's a heritage wall up in the top floor of the library. It'd be nice to put that in a more visible place within the library setting. So yeah, that's absolutely here as part of the consultation. But the commitment is, to have a library as part of the scheme in the hub building. I can see Eamon's got his hand up, so he might want to supplement whatever I've just said.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll just wanted to say that we're very clear about the re-provision of the library, and as Paul says, it's sort of how you do that rather than whether you do that. So it's how you deliver a space in a library that reflects not just the here and now, but really the demands of where the library will be over the next few decades. And it's very clear actually that there's a huge demand for adult education. There's a big emphasis now on skills and training. There's a lot of work around flexible space for work, and so libraries and their functions have changed over many years, and I think over the next few decades will continue to do so. So having some flexibility around it while still making it a place that is free and accessible for residents, that is a place of learning and development, but it might be that it's not it's not just lifting and shifting what is currently in the library and sticking it in a new building. So I think it's really important we get views from residents about what exactly they want this place of learning to be, this sort of library space, and I do think there's lots of potential here to make it be much more accessible to people who maybe don't use a current library but would absolutely use a space where they can do more education and training into their adulthood. They could actually learn new skills and training, and that might be something actually in Greater Manchester we have a lot more of through the devolution work that the mayor and the leaders are trying to negotiate with government. We actually might have a lot more to do around skills and training and apprenticeships and technical education and adult education. So there's a huge amount here that we could actually build into a new scheme, and be interested to get, I think, more views on that. But it's very clear it's a case of how we do it, not whether we do it, and that hopefully should give some comfort to residents.
Thank you. And we've had a few people asking whether there'll be a gym. We've also had some suggestion that they'd also like to see a swimming pool. I think just coming back to that point around what the community hub will contain, how does that, what's the decision-making process for that?
Do you want me to?
Paul, yep.
Yeah,
jump into
I
that
mean,
one.
I think a gym would certainly make a good component part of the mix within the centre. In terms of the space available, wet-led gyms are kind of usually need enormous spaces. I think there's also an operator a couple of miles up the road in Whitefield. But we will, part of the next stage of this process is to test the market to see who's out there as operators and who might want to come in, and we'll have a good look at at the market. I suspect there'll be quite a lot of competition actually to get a gym facility into this location. So yeah, and I think again, it's part of the next stage of the evolution of the scheme is to kind of work out what can come in, how it can fit into the spaces, and how it complements other uses in the scheme.
Thanks, Paul. We've had quite a few questions around the car park. John, I wonder if we could perhaps come to you on that, and general questions around what will the car parking provision be? Will it be the same as there is now? A few questions raised about the distance of the car park from the centre in its proposed new location. And then also just some questions around what's the traffic impact likely to be from the proposals to kind of remove traffic from elements of the existing roads that are there now. So perhaps, John, you could give a bit more of an overview of that.
Yeah, of course. So the car park at the moment is going to be providing in the region of, let's say, 350 spaces, potentially. What that means in massing terms is we're looking at a multi-storey car park of around 3 stories. But what I must say, it's a multi-storey car park of 3 stories. We're looking at somewhere in the region of 2.4 metres floor to floor, even if that. So it's not a tall building. It's very much it's a compressed building. But again, it's very much detail. We're not into that detail as yet. The current provision, I think, is somewhere in the region of 320 spaces, maybe more. Maybe 260 spaces, or 320 something. 320. Apologies, 320 spaces in and around the current site. So we would be in excess of what's there at the moment. In terms of the proximity, I haven't got that. I'll be honest with you, I haven't got that in my head right now in terms of what the distance is from the current provision. What I would say is that obviously, as part of the landscape proposals that are brought forward, there will be significant enhancements to allow for that permeability and crossing the roads, etc., to come into the master plan. With regards to the existing highways, there will be transport assessments, transport surveys that will be ongoing. They will again start to directly inform the design as we move forwards into more detail. At this stage, we don't have that detail. It will emerge as we move through the process. So again, all I can say is existing highways, existing conditions will be very much taken account of as we look to design the appropriate place for the car park.
And just to add to that, John, people might have seen people around Prestwich with high visors on, counting cars and trip data and installing air pressure tube sensors and AMPR sensors in and out of the car park. So it's a key component to delivering that car parking strategy, is understanding not just quantum of space is needed, but do people pop in and out for 2 hours and are they spending their time in the village, or are they using it to commute to into town? It's understanding how people use the spaces as well. So that will all determine that parking strategy. So that those surveys are ongoing now before we actually kind of take all of this feedback. That will be part of the feedback to start to inform the detailed design at the next stage.
And Paul, this is probably one for you, but will the car park be charged, or will it be a free car park?
Well, I think we're a bit early. I think there is some, certainly political commitment to try and maintain free parking, certainly for short-term visits. But as we said, we've got to be careful because we'll let the facts dictate this, because we don't really want parking spaces being taken up because they're free for people to just use to dump their cars all day there and go on the Metrolink into Manchester. So I think there'll be a balance, but it needs to be worked through so that it's part of the strategy for vehicle movements as a part of the wider scheme. Eamon, I think, wants to come in as well on this.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I do think this is we've been quite clear on the political commitment here around free parking. But as Paul says, there's actually a lot of questions being asked here about restrictions on parking, even if it is free. So do you do certain amounts of time for free? Do you do certain times of the day when people can't access it to reduce the number of commuters? What does the impact have? Would those options have on the streets around the village? So there's a lot of open questions here about how you deliver parking, and I think what we want to do is try and take away the commitment around free parking, but balance that against some of these probably inevitable consequences, some of which are already with us actually at the moment. So, a lot of people say they struggle to park. But of course, we're looking at the size and capacity of parking. The answer to a lot of this, especially the traffic issues, is trying to reduce the number of car journeys where possible. So that means that we must have something, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, about walking and cycling and making it easier to get to the actual centre of the town, and not just sort of in and around the red line of the scheme. So there's a much bigger piece of work here about how you reduce perhaps unnecessary car journeys, encourage more people to keep the car at home. That's not an easy thing to do, and it's not something that you can do overnight. But as a longer term ambition in this scheme, it shouldn't be to over provide for cars and encourage demand on that. So we are looking at all of this and to try and balance some of those competing priorities.
Thanks. I think John wanted to come back in.
Thanks, Rebecca. I was mindful of answering a question that was asked in terms of the distance. So I've had it now confirmed that the distance from the Fairfax to the hub, if we can recall, we can picture that in our minds, is circa 200 metres. So just as a distance to put in everyone's mind, 200 metres is approximately the distance from what would be potentially a new 3-storey car park to the community hub.
Thanks, John. And just to confirm, because we have had a couple of questions asking about the provision of disabled parking.
Yeah, of course. So the disabled parking, again, once we get into the detail, we want to ensure that we bring forward a compliant, a regulation compliant car parking facility. So the number is yet to be determined, and there will of course be disabled parking throughout the master plan. So for instance, if we were to introduce a new park to the TFGM area where the car park currently is, we would ensure that there was a disabled parking there. Also, when we get into the detail in and around the community hub, we may introduce disabled parking there as well to cut down any travel distance needed between parking and community facilities. Very much in the detail that we will get into throughout the following months.
Thanks, John. A couple of people have asked about what we mean by de-engineering. I wonder if you could just kind of explain that in a little bit more detail.
Do you want me to pick up that one, John, or do you want to do that?
I mean, I'm happy to do that. We can share the load on that one, Lindsay. But de-engineering from our side, from an architectural perspective, is essentially about sensitizing the roads. So at the moment, the road Rectory Lane is probably 80% car or 80% highway, 20% pavement. So it's dominated by the car. What we would like to do through the landscape or with Lindsay is to invert that. So start giving the space back to the pedestrian, so it becomes more like 80% pedestrian or 80% shared between pedestrian and cyclist and landscape, and 20% car. So we're not talking about taking the car out of the master plan. We need the car to move through the master plan along Rectory Lane, for instance, to service the master plan, to allow for people to move in and out of it into the wider communities. But it's about treating it far more sensitively and slowing down the pace to encourage people to move across the road. It's all this whole idea of permeability and looking beyond the red line and blurring the boundaries between the master plan and the wider communities such that they start to fuse together in a more successful way.
Thanks, John. Stuart, did you want to come in there?
I wasn't sure whether Lindsay wanted to add from a design perspective. I've asked this question before, so it's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, we've got lots of examples of where we've de-engineered streets. So as designers, rather than historically, most streets have been designed by highway engineers, and the focus has been on cars and about movement of cars rather than about movement of people. So I think the idea of de-engineering is using all the tools available in our arsenal as designers, as trees, green infrastructure, introducing more levels of courtesy crossing, uncontrolled crossing points, squeezing streets, creating skinnier street spaces that start to moderate speeds, that create better quality environments. And where we've done it, and I can cite 3 or 4 examples. So Poynton, Altrincham, Preston. We continue to do it on other schemes around the country. every time we've done it, the moderation of speed, it gets more people back in those places, increases footfall, stimulates economic activity, and creates a better quality environment, places that people want to be in. So it works, and we can prove that it works. And actually, it makes us for safer streets as well. So it doesn't stop vehicles. It's actually increasing economic revenue, but it creates safer places and reduces accident rates because cars are generally moving more slowly. It's not stopping them. It's not taking them out. It's actually just moderating speeds. Sometimes that's about taking out traffic lights as well as other measures. But we always have to think about sort of visually impaired access and all of those challenges that come with that multimodal transport of people as well. So all those there's a whole raft of design to do to get to the detail of that. But I think the aspiration is if we can start to rather than create the current collar of a highway around this village core, to break that collar and create a place for people that will truly regenerate the village core, we believe.
And Lindsay, there's some questions being raised here or comments about the existing traffic levels and that there's current issues already. How do you ensure that what you're doing isn't going to exacerbate those?
Well, I think what we've already talked about, there's an initial bit of work on the traffic counts and traffic data. We now have a highways specialist on the team as well. So they're coming in. The design team is growing now, moving through this process, and an understanding of the trip counts, understanding of where the congestion is, why that congestion is there. Is it about creating more space, or is it about understanding how signalization works at certain places? So there's a huge number of technical reasons. There's a lot of black magic around these designing streets and understanding junctions. So sometimes it's about taking away things to make flow better, and there's sometimes a perception thing where you get a lot of traffic in a place because of a set of traffic lights. Actually, the traffic's not bad. The traffic would flow quite nicely if there weren't traffic lights in a place. That's one technique you can do, but I think we need to look at much wider way outside of the red line to start to unpick some of the wider challenges as part of that traffic study to understand how we can maximize the value of the place within the village itself.
Thank you. Stuart, did you want to jump back in?
Yeah, it was just to add we get really quickly fixated on cars and car movements because it's important and it's what we know today. And we've actually started a really good and useful debate with Walk Ride Greater Manchester, so Walk Ride GM, and Nick Hubble, who actually sits on the community liaison group and really challenging the future of transport in and around GM and how Prestwich can act as a connector or a place that actually encourages and engages that. So the cars are really important and we will do all the diligence, but don't be blindsided that that's the only thing that we'll focus on. We want to make sure this is a place for the future and protected for the future. And again, that's not just electric bikes, electric scooters, it's how are people going to move around in the future. So Nick is thoroughly engaged and a cracking challenge. So it's just all those conversations are there. It's multifaceted, transport and movement around the village.
Thank you, Stuart. I just wanted to pick up then on some of the questions that we've had around what happens to the current tenants in the Longfield Centre. So Paul, perhaps you could come in and talk through that for us.
Yeah, I mean, we are actively engaged with all the tenants in the centre. We want to try and keep the existing centre running for as long as possible. We want to try and avoid having too many voids and blank spaces as we run up towards the demolition of the Longfield Centre. We are looking at how the programme's phased and to see whether we can get some retail options to decant and.
Paul, we've lost you.
Right, I just cut out then, but
I
just briefly cut out then, but yeah. So yeah, we will seek to try to find ways to keep the existing tenants who want to move into the new scheme to move in, and that's really part of the design of the phasing plan and how how the first sort of retail blocks will come forward.
And how much will the rent be for the new units, and how do we ensure that they are actually for independent businesses?
Well, we're not at the point where we can set rents, but we will take advice on what we think fair market rents are for the spaces. In terms of the retailer mix that goes in, I think it's fair to say we're not looking at putting in the kind of big, larger block units that would attract kind of bigger high street names. I think we see this as more of an independent led offer. But again, this is something we're still working our way through, and the exact strategy for who the retail occupants will be will emerge. And again, through the consultation, if people feel strongly there's missing kind of bits of retail provision or types of provision they'd like to see, them use the consultation to tell us, and it can inform some of our thinking.
Thanks, Paul. And if someone is interested in taking space within the development in the future, what should they do? Stuart, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, we've got agents engaged, liaising with the tenants at the moment. The council own the Longfield and lead all of that tenant engagement to date. You can get in touch through the agents who I think have got signboards around the centre. Get in touch with any of us. We want to engage with everyone in the wider community. And I think if I just touch on Paul's point about future rents, are right, we're not set, but it'll be a mix of, it needs to be accessible to make sure smaller independents can come and grow and thrive, and they've got appropriate space, and then grow, move into a bigger unit and move up a bigger unit. And I'm not saying this is the answer to Prestwich, but an example of what we've done on other scheme is excess energy generation through solar panels. So PVs on the roofs of the buildings subsidises the energy of some of the smaller independents, and especially in a world today where rising energy prices, things like that, and little, they're not tricks, but just bits of intelligence that we can apply to it to make sure that I find it really difficult because you can focus on independent, saying that's the be all and end all, because there's some businesses that aren't independent that will still be relevant to Prestwich and that other people will want to see. But I think making it accessible for all is the key, and having a mix of spaces.
Councillor O'Brien, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So I just wanted to share again with residents that we had a great meeting today with, it was a drop-in session for tenants of the current shopping centre. This is sort of one of many meetings I know the team have had with individuals, but it was a great opportunity for them to come in and actually talk through the plans together, share some thoughts and ideas, and they picked up a lot of these issues and asked a lot of these questions that have already come up. So it was very good to see. I was happy to be there. Lots of different people popping in, asking questions and feeding back their views and thoughts, and I'm sure we'll be continuing that. I think when we start talking about things like rent and other things, as others have said, we're not quite at that stage. But of course, fundamental to all of this is a higher performing centre for the town. So more people living there, more people using it not just until a certain point in time and then it kind of closes down, but using it as much through the day as possible, driving more footfall. And so there is benefits to be had here over that medium and long term by improving the town as it currently is, and creating that sort of vibrant village feel to it. I think there's a view at the moment that it kind of shuts down after a certain point. While some businesses, I think, are doing really well, they're sort of doing well despite that underperformance. And what we want to try and do is unlock a lot of that potential, and so make it better for everybody. And I'm sure when we do that, it will be a sort of fair reflection of how we come to those details. But it is important to just say that the discussions have already been taking place and will continue to take place with tenants, because as much as the residents are, the existing businesses have a real heart already in the community, and it would be a real shame to lose that, which I'm sure we won't.
Thank you. Could I perhaps bring John back in again then, just to answer a couple of questions that we'd had around the design of the buildings, and a few people just sort of commenting that they want to ensure that they reflect the local character, and we've had a few people saying they're not very keen on some of the precedent images that we've shared. But perhaps, John, if you could explain what we've shown to date, and what that was intended to show, and
Yeah, of
how we'll
course.
kind of use the sort of local area to influence the design.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The local area will be pivotal to the way we approach the design of the buildings. As we've all been saying throughout this presentation, we are so early on in the journey in terms of the design process that we're not at that stage. We're quite away from that stage, really. But when we do get to that stage, the character, the heritage, the vernacular of Prestwich will directly inform the way we treat the buildings. The buildings that we showed throughout the presentation, they were there really to show an idea of scale. It was more about how the buildings engage with the street. So we're looking at 3-story townhouses, a brick vernacular. Yes, the brickwork might not have been the right texture, the right tone, but we're looking at a very rich stock. What we'd also bring forward as a master plan is we wouldn't just take one brick and apply it everywhere. We'd make it rich and varied. I think it's really important to have a master plan that has that richness through it, such that it starts to break it up. It breaks up the scale of massing just through the use of materials and the sensitive use of materials. The use of slate, looking at the roof pitches. Do we have pitched roofs rather than flat roofs, for example, on some of the townhouses? So there's lots of stuff for us to go at when we get to that stage. But I keep repeating myself, the character of Prestwich and understanding that in a real granular detail will be pivotal to the way we approach the buildings.
Thank you, John. Stuart, one for you. How will you manage disruption during the redevelopment?
Probably touches upon a comment that Paul made just earlier. So looking at a phasing plan for the scheme, so that there won't be a big bulldozer in there dropping everything flat site and building everything. There are statutory requirements, but we take it pretty seriously. We know we're in the middle of a residential neighbourhood that people commute through, that's got schools around it. There'll be a detailed construction management plan dealing with noise, dust, working hours, construction traffic movements and logistics plans and the like. I think for us, the key is in the phasing strategy of when buildings are removed, tenants are moved, relocated to other building, and building things step by step rather than just doing it as one fell swoop. So kind of the earlier phase, we're currently looking at retail buildings for tenant relocations, the car, I'm going to say the car park, but again, things aren't fixed in stone, but I want to be quite open with where our thoughts are, because then we can get the comment and challenge back and, I don't agree with that, let's try something different. And the hub building, so that all sits in the first phase as an absolute intent with the square in the middle that creates that new kind of vibrant place in phase one. And then future phases to be determined. So that's the intent for the autumn. I think it's probably useful to say, if this means anything to anyone, would be a hybrid planning application, where we'd look at an outline planning application for the whole red line area to say, massing, scale, density, use, and then phase one, as I've just described, would come as detailed plans, which would then show, the full detailed use in terms of how the elevations will look, the height, and a further progressed design. And that just gives a bit of a flavour of where we're heading in terms of design detailing.
Thanks very much, Stuart. And in terms of things like meanwhile use, is that something that you'll be looking at?
Absolutely. We've not determined what that is, but we do want to speak to the community about what would they use, what would you see a benefit of there being in the village while the works are ongoing. So there'll be a period where there's some demolition happening, but all the car parks are still there. Is there an opportunity to use an area of the car park? Is there a small pop-up like Lindsay? It's not a small pop-up really anymore. The Pilcrow pub is actually a great meanwhile use that's stayed semi-permanent now. For us, it's what will people use? And it's really, really key to us to have that engagement. because we're not going to be building anything here this year, early part of next year. So we just want to have that engagement to determine what would be a good community use. So ideas on a postcard. We could give examples of what we've done elsewhere, but they just wouldn't be right for the community. So we just want to listen. It's the key for us is to listen next few months, kind of digest all the information.
Thanks, Stuart. And we've also had some people asking about the outdoor space. Will there be space for live events, that kind of thing? And also a couple of comments around the fountain that they wouldn't be too concerned if that went. But we would quite like to see the stone slabs and the pavers, with the quotes from local people, kept in the scheme. So Lindsay, I don't know if you want to jump in there just to give us a bit of a feel for what you're thinking for the kind of outdoor space.
That's interesting feedback actually on the stone. We the research we've done on it, I think the original piece was about 15 years ago, and there was some glass inlays, glass pieces, and then I think there was some damage, so they were taken away and then replaced with the granite and inlaid in granite. But certainly the poetry that's inlaid in there, we could certainly recycle back into the scheme. We trying to increasingly, back to the sustainability point, to see we'd do an audit of the existing materials and anything of quality. We would try to recycle and upcycle, whether it's in this scheme or within the wider neighbourhood, rather than just putting this. We don't want to get rid of anything to landfill if it's got a use. So in terms of the scale of the space, yeah, it could hold larger events. We just to give people maybe a perception of the scale. The closest example we've seen is the First Street Square. So for people know Home in Manchester, that space is 28 meters wide by 60 meters long at the main core of the space, which is almost identical to the sort of scale of the space we're talking about, and that's in one neighbourhood of Manchester, but that feels, and the way the levels work actually is very similar. There's a similar language to some of the initial thinking around just around the scale and the way people use that space. The design of it, that can be completely different, but the flexibility of that space can easily hold 1,000 people, but actually it feels very comfortable holding 50 people. So that's what we're trying to do, is create a community space. We've tested ideas around green, village square, village. What is it? What's its character? What does the community want there? How do they want this space to work in the longer term?
And we've had a comment here about love the street green space. Can this be extended down to St Mary's Road to give a proper village access avenue feel? One for you to think about.
Want to think about, yeah. I think as part of that's another one that's outside of the red line, isn't it? But it's certainly driving the opportunity of what that could become. Yeah.
And also some questions here around pedestrian and cycle access. So the importance of improving pedestrian experience across Bury New Road and into the site. Also, have we considered cycle and pedestrian connectivity into the Heaton Park active neighbourhood? Lindsay, probably another one for you.
I think the answers, we've thought about it, we've walked it, we've looked at it, but we that next level of design now, which about getting the sort of the highway specialist on board, is to start to really test those ideas in more detail to see where those opportunities are to create a more connected neighbourhood from a cycling and a walking perspective, and then ideally hooking into those, if there's any budgets available to try and influence those to improve those linkages. It'd be fantastic if we could. Through our design work, we're demonstrating how it can be done, and hopefully we can draw on some of those TFGM's wider work, Barry's wider work about those linkages. That would be fantastic. Yeah. So it's all part of that next process.
Just to add that we've had a couple of people now commenting that they don't like the stones, so I don't think that that's a blanket that we should keep them. So make sure you send your comments into us through the consultation around what you want to see there. Stuart, did you want to come
in? It was slightly touching upon that. So we've obviously focused on like bits of artwork, effectively, and the stone and the granite in the centre, but every material that will be taken out of the centre or demolished, we'll be doing demolition reuse assessments with everything. We, like Lindsay pointed, we don't want to send anything to landfill. If we can crush it and use it for piling mats and kind of ground floor slabs, anywhere where we can reuse materials, we will be doing. And that's kind of part of our approach to the wider sustainability piece, and not just focusing on energy, it's the embodied carbon coming out of removing buildings, which there is inherently. So there's just a commitment to that, and there will be a whole host of reports that go public about kind of where we get to in terms of our commitments.
That led me very nicely onto the next question, which is why are we not keeping the buildings if sustainability is at the core of the scheme?
Adaptive reuse assessment is they're just not fit for purpose to be retained and used to deliver the regenerative benefit in the village. And Paul will probably be able to, maybe even Councillor O'Brien, attest this more than I can, but the roofs are falling in, and you know, what would we be left with? A bit of a skeleton of a frame that would really severely impact on the regenerative benefit of what we're trying to achieve in the village. But I'm happy for others to jump in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we talked earlier about the grain of the streets and the links, and yeah, I don't think anyone would say the kind of existing walk on a kind of rainy Monday evening at 7 o'clock through the Longfield Centre, underneath the kind of the arch, through the car park to the metro station is an appealing kind of layout in any circumstance. So I think it's right. We try and use whatever materials that are on site and reuse them, but that, yeah, the buildings are seriously flawed, and yeah, and it's not just in their condition. It's in the layout of the centre itself as well.
Paul, could I ask you about the sprung dance floor? Because I know that came up at our drop-in on Sunday as well. What's the plans with the sprung dance floor, which is obviously very popular locally?
Well, I mean, we will want to provide some space in the new hub for groups who want to kind of meet up to do fitness classes, but yeah, I don't think we'll be looking at trying to replace like for like a sprung dance floor. We haven't, I think it's fair to say, got a strategy at this point for what you might do with a sprung dance floor, but yeah, I think, you know, we understand it's part of the heritage, but you know, it's difficult to provide the amount of space in a building remotely economically on a like-for-like basis.
Yeah, just to say, Rebecca, that some work has already started looking at, could it go somewhere else? Could it be integrated into different new buildings? Could it be relocated to somewhere else in the borough even? But I think we're still in that process. And you know, obviously there's some fond memories of it, and it was well liked by those who used it. But clearly one of the pitfalls we also had was it wasn't used enough to make that centre viable in its current form and its sort of previous form. So there's clearly a work still ongoing around that, and if possible, find some other use of or location for it. But as Paul says, it's quite a challenge to sort of keep absolutely everything and integrate that into the new scheme as it currently stands.
Thank you. We've had a couple of people asking around just the general timescales. So I don't know, Stuart, if you want to come in on that one, just to give a bit of a feel for how long construction would take.
I think the first phase would be a couple of years. So if we're looking on site for early 25, the end of 26, the programme's not defined, determined. We've not got a construction partner and full supply chain on board, but that's where we're at in terms of making sure we've consulted and got the community engagement now, worked through the detailed design, reconsulted on that detailed design, you know, test and challenge. Did we listen properly before we then submit a planning application in the autumn or towards the back end of the year, to work through that process of procuring a supplier and contractor to work with us to then come and start the construction of the phases. So outline timeline today when asked, they're the dates that we're working to this year. So we would say planning this year, construction a year, commences a year later, a couple of years on site. We're talking in broad terms.
Thank you. I've had a question here around what will make this unique. What is it that the Prestwich is going to be known for when this project's complete? Don't know, Councillor O'Brien, do you want to come in with your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, it would be helpful to understand what residents' views are on topics like that. So, you know, not just some of the specifics, but I'm a resident of the town, the wider town, and I've lived there all my life. And what we've seen Prestwich develop and change over those sort of years is its growing reputation as a fantastic place to move to live in, to eat and drink, to go to the green spaces around it. It's got great accessibility. It's sort of in the centre really of some amazing transport connections with the Metrolink and the motorway, and hopefully in future with better buses. So it's a fantastic place to be already, and it's often highlighted as one of the best places to live in the country through lots of different newspapers and magazines and competitions. And I think sometimes it's said, oh, we could be the Didsbury of the North or the Charlton of the North. But actually, I don't really think that is our ambition here, to sort of replicate someone else's success. It is to try and be true to the place of Prestwich. And so how do we stand out, and what would the ambition be? Well, I think we want to be one of those places that, yes, it's a town of people, it's got a wider town of tens of thousands of people, but also has this sort of village at the heart of it. Maybe you might call it a sort of urban village or a new village, which is, it has those modern elements in it, but is still rooted in its heritage. And I think that's something that we can achieve in this. We can make the nods to the people from Prestwich who've made history, the William Sturgeons of the world, who doesn't necessarily get the credit for his creativity and inventions, and yet lies, in St Mary's churchyard. So there's a lot here that we can nod to. The Victorian heritage, really even has a Roman heritage. So there's a lot here that we can pull from, whilst also situating it in a modern city region, as part of Greater Manchester, which is itself a vibrant and growing place. So it's almost, can we make a merit? Can we make a positive out of that contrast between the heritage and the sense that we want to look to the future? And I think we can do that here, and hopefully through the skills of everybody on the call, but also residents as well, we can try and pull out those bits that make us stand out. Because I don't want to be Didsbury in North Manchester or Charlton. I think we want to be Prestwich. And I think there's a lot in Prestwich we can be proud of as it stands, and maybe just a lot more that we can add into that future generations to be proud of as well.
Thanks. I think we're getting very close to the end of our time here, but Councillor O'Brien, we sort of touched on this before, but we've had a couple of people kind of asking the question, how certain are we that this is going to happen this time? There's obviously been previous plans. What's your thoughts?
Well, yes, it's true, and I think it's almost been talked about for as long as I've been alive, in some parts. And I started the call saying I thought if it didn't happen now, it probably wouldn't ever happen. And I do sort of stand by that. I think we've got all of the pieces in place, and sometimes it will be a question of time and how you deliver it, and when you deliver it, rather than if you deliver it. And that might be dictated by things outside of our control. I mean, look at the last couple of years we've had. But all of the pieces are in place to deliver a fantastic scheme here. We've got the ownership sorted. We've got the partnerships sorted. We've got, I think, already some really fantastic interest from residents. We've got buy-in from partners. We're already having those discussions with health, with transport, and with the wider public services. And the finances, whilst it's tough for local councils at the moment, we are facing very significant cuts still, about 30 odd million this year on top of 110 we've been cut over the last 13 years. We can actually use this scheme to drive some values, to invest back into the town. We can use our borrowing. We've already set aside close to 20 million actually from the council's budgets alone to invest in some of the early stages of this. So all of those pieces are starting to come together. And what we've got to have now is a bit of self-belief in that we can achieve this. We've got to be ambitious, and we've got to all work through this together. And I think that the response so far from residents is they really want to see this happen, and so do we. And so hopefully that's a good sign as well.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I'm conscious that there's quite a lot of questions we haven't managed to get around to answering tonight. So please do get in touch with us with any of the kind of contact channels that we've showed before if you've got a question that we've not managed to get around to answering tonight. I would like to thank all of our panelists for taking part, and to everyone that's attended and given up their evenings, and for all of your questions. I hope it's given you lots of details about the plans. As I said before, this conversation closes on the 17th of March, so please do make sure that you submit your responses. Filling in those forms, whether that's online or the hard copy ones, is the way to ensure that the feedback gets through to the project team. So please do that. So thank you, everybody, and we'll just draw the webinar to a close.